And when we simplify a power of I, remember we're going to go to the highest power of 4, not power of 4, multiple of 4. So if I have I to the 53, I to the 53, what's the highest multiple of 4 we can take out of 53? 52. So I'm going to break that apart to I to the 52 times I, because we know that every time we hit a multiple of 4, it equals 1. So that I to the 52 equals 1. And you're left with just 1 times I, or just I. All right, I to the 79, we need the highest multiple of 4. 76. And I'm left with 3. Now, when you take your tests in a couple of weeks, if you don't remember that I cubed is negative I, you can break that I cubed down even further, because most of you remember that I squared is negative 1. So if you break that down even further to 76 plus 2 plus 1, then that's going to give you, because this is 1, I squared is negative 1, and then you have an I left over. So you know that that's going to simplify down to negative I. So the answer to number 1 is positive I and negative I. This is Appendix 7, which is not on our skills check. A skills check is not a test or a quiz. I don't want you all, it's not that. It's literally practice for the test and quiz. It doesn't go in a test category. It's just for you, mainly for you. And this counts as less than a homework grade. So it's not anything to be, it's open note. Just see if you kind of understand the process, and then we can move forward from there. All right, let's look at question number 2. Completing the square. Did anyone actually do number 2 yet? All right, so number 2 is a recipe that I gave you when we started this. So just be mindful that when you complete the square, you do not want it to equal 0, okay? So for completing the square, and it looks like I gave you one that was pretty easy, you add the 9. So that's x squared minus 16x equals 9. And then we complete the square. So we're going to take our b value, which is negative 16, divided by 2, and square it. So negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8, and negative 8 squared is positive 64. So I'm adding that to both sides. And this is going to factor down to a perfect square. So that actually factors down to x minus 8 squared equals 73. I just want to make sure, because, you know, I know it is, but I just want to make sure. All right, so now what are we going to do? Square root. 73, can any of these numbers divide into 73? No, so this is actually even easier. So your final answer, I'm going to write it off to the left. It's going to be x minus 8 equals plus and minus 73. And when you add the 8, it just goes right in front. And that would be your final answer. Okay, so go ahead, draw a line. We're going to start Appendix 9, which is interval notation. So interval notation is Appendix 9. It's, if you are titling your notes, that's the title. But Appendix 9 is interval notation and solving inequalities. So a couple things to keep in mind, which I believe you've all seen interval notation, is that if it is equal to, we use a bracket. So for equal to, we use a bracket. If it's not equal, if it's greater than or less than, we use a parentheses. And infinity always gets a parentheses. So if it's a positive or negative infinity, that always gets a parentheses. So that's just really, raise your hand if you have seen interval notation. I do believe that's something we talk about in Algebra 2. So, okay. So we're just going to write some intervals using interval notation. All right, let's go ahead and copy down questions 1 through 4, and we're going to write all of these intervals using interval notation. Now, I should probably also add here that when you do your intervals, you always start with the smallest number on the left, and then the largest number is on the right. So just a reminder. So when you do your interval notation, whatever is the smallest number in the interval, you're going to write that first. And then the largest number comes last. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back here. So for this interval, it says 0 is less than or equal to x, which is less than and equal to 4. So the smallest number in the interval is 0, and the largest number is 4. And because x equals both of those, then they would both get a bracket. So that is just another way to say that, except we're doing it in interval notation. For question number 2, it says x is greater than 8. So that means that the first number we're starting at is 8. And if it's greater, it's going towards positive infinity. So in interval notation, we would say 8 to infinity. Now 8 is going to get a parentheses because it's not equal. Infinity always gets a parentheses. You never put a bracket on an infinity. So on the number line, so if it's 8, it would have an open circle, and it's greater than, so it would go to the right. So if you look at it, if you think about it on a graph, the first number you hit is 8, and it goes forever towards positive infinity. So that's why it is 8 to infinity. For question number 3, the smallest number is -1, so that would get a parentheses because it's not equal to. So notice how there's not a line underneath this inequality. So this -1 gets a parentheses, but the 2 is equal, so that would get a bracket. So it is possible in interval notation to have both a parentheses and a bracket. And for this last one, you have x is less than 3. So if 3 is here, it would have a closed circle. And it's coming from the left because it's less than. So it's coming from negative infinity. So if it's a less than inequality, negative infinity comes first. That gets a parentheses. 3 would get a bracket. And that would be your interval notation for all 4. All right, so let's go ahead and answer these 2, and then we'll end there. So now we're just solving inequalities. And then you're going to write your answer in interval notation. So for question number 1, we would start off by adding the 7, which gives you 3x is greater than 9. And then how will we get rid of that 3? Divide. We only flip the inequality if you're dividing or multiplying by a negative. So this would be x is greater than 3. Which means in interval notation, it would be 3 to infinity. And this is how we, when you take your test, and in your homework, this is homework 3 now, you want to make sure you write your answers in interval notation. All right, go ahead and try to do question 2. Uh-oh, what did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? Oh, okay. I was like, uh-oh. Okay. It's early in the morning. Okay, let's look at number 2. Go ahead and distribute the -5, combine your like terms, and try to solve it for x. So this is our last question for today. So appendix 9, again, is just interval notation and solving inequalities. Now, for inequality, you do want x to be on the left. It's just easier to write it in interval notation when you put x on the left. It's not necessary, but I'm going to write it both ways. Okay, so I got a fraction. So the way this is written, it says, if you read it left to right, it says negative 2/3 is less than or equal to x, which can be a little confusing. So I like to write it, whenever I have an inequality, I'm just going to rewrite it and flip everything. Because if negative 2/3 is less than or equal to x, that means x is greater than and equal to negative 2/3. So when you write your inequality, it's going to have a bracket on the negative 2/3. So negative 2/3 is the smallest number in the interval. And it's going towards positive infinity because it is greater than.